Right, take two, everybody. Now, first of all, I wanted to remind you that the course that I just did made it very clear that we shouldn't worry too much about naming other authors and naming other texts, because quite often I think we get confused and we try and find another piece. Instead, we're going to look at the idea of AO4 through the idea of typicality or atypicality, how it's the same as other texts or how it's very different from other texts, okay? So I want to start off first with form in this text, though, okay? You will see that it's a third-person text, is it not, yeah? But it uses what we call free indirect discourse. You'll remember that. Free indirect discourse gives you the opportunity to move in and out of a character's head. Omniscient narration tends to be what they use in 19th century novels, isn't it? Like The Mill on the Floss that you did previously. In this one, we don't quite have first person, but it's almost like first person, isn't it? The minute you stepped out into the factory gates, you thought no more about your work. So we're plunged at the beginning into the world of Arthur. And Arthur's world is a world of resistance. You'll notice he uses the idea about you thought no more about your work. Well, that's not really the kind of attitude that you're going to want from an employee, isn't it? So first of all, the first thing that he says is resistance. Resistance to the workplace. Resistance to the idea that your work has meaning. He, like many working class people, sees work as purely instrumental, and he sees the bosses and the authorities as his enemy, who want to extract work from him. So that means that he is going to resist, doesn't it? And the passage is all about resistance. In the first part, you'll notice that the tone is almost whimsical, dreamlike fantasy. So, we will see, for instance, the juxtaposition of two different things. The key phrase that I'm going to pick out is excruciating din of flying and flapping belts slipping out. The fricative Fs are there deliberately to create a sense of the noise, how unpleasant the environment is, how routine it is, how it's automatic. This is work that you cannot enjoy. It's monotonous. So, what do we have then? We have him resisting by thinking about pleasant events. So the idea of the imagination and your inner life as a form of resistance is something you will recognize from The Handmaid's Tale, won't you? In Offred's case in The Handmaid's Tale, she cannot overtly and explicitly resist because she's living in a police state, isn't she? However, in Arthur's case, he's living in a democracy and he's living in an environment in which there are unions. And so he does have a little bit more of a voice. But in the first part, we're seeing him resisting with his imagination. And he refers to it as pipe dreams, as impossible fantasy. Well, this motif of escape, I think you'll agree, is a post-1945 idea, getting away from. So one of the first things we notice about post-1945 literature is that people are not prepared to put up with the crap that they used to. We could see that. Why is that? Well, for all the reasons that we've dealt with previously, haven't we? We've talked about the anger with the war, a new kind of emancipated and empowered working class, trade union movements. In Britain, a very socialist government that introduced free education, free universities, free healthcare. And in our play, A Streetcar Named Desire, because remember we can use those texts as well, we see it in Stanley, don't we? I'm king of my house. You remember Stanley says, doesn't he? So we see this kind of working class male, no longer submissive, no longer prepared to defer to those in authority, now overtly and explicitly antagonistic, adversarial, determined to carve out the world in the image that they want it to be in. Now that takes the form, as we saw last week, or last lesson, in often despising their forefathers and older generations. We do not see that in this extract, but later we'll see that Jack, Brenda's husband, represents the kind of conformist man that Arthur holds in contempt, doesn't he? So here we have Arthur thinking of pleasant events, of pipe dreams, and you will notice in the second paragraph that he actually refers to it as glorious loony colour. Now what do you think that might be referring to? I'm sure you all recognize that seems to be referring to the cinema, isn't it? And loony perhaps referring to Looney Tunes, to cartoons, and this idea of vivid color. Now you youngsters have grown up with color. The idea of black and white is unimaginable to you. Put it back into context, 1950, color is new. The media is a rich and exciting medium. People are spending more on going to the cinema, going to the pictures, as they used to call them, than ever before. So what does that mean? It means that people are constantly escaping, aren't they? They're seeing America. In the British psyche for young people, America is a kind of paradise in nirvana because it's wealthy, it's affluent, it shows people happy, it shows a hedonistic culture. So we've got all of these things that we've talked about before in the leisure society of pop music, of a real confidence in youth culture, of a stuff you adult generation who didn't know how to enjoy yourself, okay? And there's that form of resistance coming through. So we've probably got 2 paragraphs there, don't you think? Probably got one on the hideousness of the present and the fact that he escapes through his imagination. And then we'd probably want to go on to this idea of the magic lantern. We'd probably want to weave that quote. And the glorious loony color. Glorious because you see the juxtaposition of the mundanity, the boringness of the present, the hideousness of the factory, and doesn't that contrast with the richness of the media and the world of fantasy and escape? That seems to indicate. Moving down now, where's my 3rd paragraph going to be? Well, I'm going to suggest to you, and I hope you agree with me, that the resistance actually intensifies. And in this section of the passage, what Arthur's doing is he's thinking about how he can get away with doing nothing. So his resistance is going to take the form of non-cooperation. Now, if you want to put this into context, you need to think to yourself, we're about to go through a period in British history of massive trade union action and strikes, and that this will eventually lead to the miners' strike in England that took place in the early 1980s, where you had a massive confrontation between working class trade unions and the conservative Thatcher government who smashed them. But until that point, Britain becomes an industrial nightmare where there's lots of resistance and friction between working class people and employers, okay? So the phrase that I'd want to use is a well-disguised nothing. It's a lovely phrase. What does it mean? Pretending like he's doing something, isn't he? And he's so happy. Listen to his tone. He's smug, isn't he? He sees himself as a success. He understands that life is a game, doesn't he? And that he's an excellent actor. So he knows exactly how to look like he's working when he's not. So his attitude to labor, as you can see, is, I owe these guys nothing. Work is just there for me to get away with as much as I can. There is no point in trying hard. When he looks at Jack later on, he sees Jack as a fool, doesn't he? As a conformist idiot. And whereas he sees himself as being a really clever, conniving individual. And now all of you, and I remember Josiah remembers this very well, I'll never let anybody grind me down. Where does it come from? Handmaid's Tale. Okay, so did Margaret Atwood read Saturday Night and Sunday Morning? Well, we don't know, do we? But it is such a popular saying that you could almost say that it is the zeitgeist. Do you remember that term? Zeitgeist in German means spirit of the age. Okay? I'll write it down here. You'll be able to see it. Zeitgeist. Okay? So don't let the bastards grind you down. And you'd want to say something about the bastards, wouldn't you? Because it shows this kind of antipathy, this us and them feeling. It shows aggression, doesn't it? And that form of aggression actually becomes much more intense because he actually fantasizes about 100 weight of dynamite and blowing up the factory, doesn't he? Yeah. Now, is this kind of Marxist revolution, does he seem to be speaking for his fellow workers? Yeah, totally so. So that's why I would not be inclined to see this in a Marxist way. Although Alan Sillitoe himself was very left-wing, I don't think Arthur sounds like, hey, I want to do nice things to help my fellow workers. What about you? It seems to me to be more the Holden Caulfield, doesn't it, Adam, where he's actually expressing antisocial attitudes, highly individualistic attitudes. And this aggression here doesn't seem to be aimed solely at bosses, does it? It seems to be aimed at lots of different people. In fact, anyone who is different to him. So if we're thinking about typicality now, we might say that this is the archetype of the angry young man, isn't it? Whether that's Jimmy Porter and Look Back in Anger, whether it's Holden Caulfield, whether it's Graham Greene, The Distractors. We do see a lot of young men, in particular, angry, sticking their fingers up at society, determined to resist, believing that their individuality is of great importance. We could arguably link it to Stanley in A Streetcar Named Desire. Only Stanley, like a lot of American fiction, seems more positive. He does seem to want to get on in the world, doesn't he? So he seems more wedded to the American dream. Whereas I think that we're looking here more at a British kind of working class idea of resistance of authority in this particular extract, okay? I'm going to go on to the final page before I stop. Now, what would my final paragraph be? My final paragraph, I think, would be looking at Jack, because I think we know that he actually has absolutely a contempt for Jack. Jack is Brenda's husband. As we know, Arthur is sleeping with Brenda, isn't he? He shows absolutely no sign of guilt, no sign that this is somebody else's wife or property, whatever, to use a very traditional idea. He's very blasé about the fact that he just seeks his sexual gratification, doesn't he? He's wedded, as we said earlier, to the pleasure principle and to the idea that his pleasure and his fun is the center of his existence. That's why, if I could briefly turn back, if I could make up my mind which page to be on, it would be better, wouldn't it? The world of pubs and noisy tarts is his paradise, isn't it? He is the early clubber, isn't he? The idea, as the title of the novel suggests, that what really matters in life is pleasure, even if that pleasure is temporary, even if it is only Saturday night and Sunday morning. That is what we live for. We live for those windows of pleasure and fun and leisure, and the routine existence of society is something to block out. And what moments of being, moments of reality in which you are a true individual happen when you are away from work, away from responsibility, okay? And that's why I think Jack, and this is his resistance, he's resisting traditional roles. Because Jack's a good man, isn't he, Klaus? Okay? He's a good guy. He's working nights. Why is he working nights? To earn more money, to make his wife, who's sleeping with his mate, happier. He's a good family man. He's got dutiful working class morals, where he sees his life as labor to better his family. Well, what's Arthur's take on this? Does he sound like he has any admiration for him? No, the tone is that of contempt, isn't it? He's happy about getting a bigger pay packet and a change. And I'm happy, and I know Brenda's happy. Everybody's happy. It's actually quite a sarcastic kind of tone, isn't it? In which he justifies the fact that he's selfish, that he sleeps with another man's wife, that he puts his pleasure first, that he has absolutely no loyalty. Don't forget that Jack is his friend who he goes out drinking with, and he sits chatting to him knowing that the night before he was sleeping with his wife, yeah? It's a fine world, sometimes. And if you don't weaken, well, this would be my conclusion, okay? Because he looks at others, and others who conform, he sees as failures, as emasculated, yeah? As weak. And I think that that's really interesting, because we very much can address AO4 here, can't we, with this idea of typicality. We have the angry young working class man. No one's going to push him around. Other generations have given in. Listen to the determination of his tone as he ends. Or if you don't, give the bastard a chance to get you cracking with that carborundum. And he uses Latin there, doesn't he, to show that he's not frightened of the language of the ruling class, which is what Latin is, isn't it? It's the language of privilege and the educated elite, isn't it? And he uses it and he appropriates it for himself. So we're looking at a kind of working class man who is not going to put up with what he has done in the past. Now I want you to link that to A Taste of Honey. I want you to link that to Small Island, where we see black people standing up against authority. We have a general trend of people no longer accepting the past, no longer accepting hierarchy, wanting to have a new kind of culture in which you self-fashion, you make yourself, you change. They resist on many levels, as we've seen. You resist those in authority. You resist through the imagination, don't you? You resist the older generation. You resist your family. And finally here, there's no way Arthur's going to settle down with some girl. His ideal relationship is sex without strings, is it not? Okay?